Good evening. A critical week for the miners' strike. Will it flare up into an all-out war between the unions and the government? Or will it fizzle out, as cabinet ministers are predicting privately, with the divided miners drifting back to work? Today, with little changed, miners were still crossing picket lines, and the coal board claimed 45 pits were working normally. But at the same time, as we shall be seeing in a minute, this dispute has turned miners in some areas once regarded as moderate into the strike's staunchest backers. Although they're still not talking to each other, both sides in the dispute are in the Panorama studio tonight. Mr. Ned Smith, the chief negotiator for the coal board, and Mr. Arthur Scargill, president of the National Union of Mine Workers. Well, so far the strike hasn't had much effect on most people's everyday lives, but it's costing both sides in the coal industry dear. Already, 20 million tonnes of coal worth some £900 million have not been mined, and the striking miners have on average lost over £1,000 each in pay. All this in an industry which over the past 10 years has cost the taxpayer, in today's prices, £11.5 billion. As for the government, it's a battle that Mrs. Thatcher can't be seen to lose, especially now that Labour is backing the miners. But as the battle lines are drawn, what perhaps has become overshadowed are the issues that led to the dispute in the first place. Jeremy Paxman has been to North East England.
On Good Friday in the village of Merton, the Miners' Band plays for the Miners' football teams competing for the Retired Miners' Cup before a crowd of miners. In areas like this, the pit is the community. Support for the strike is solidly militant.
I'm not a militant. I don't even attend union meetings, so... The majority of people in Merton are not militant. Majority of miners are not militant. All they're doing is fighting for their way of life.
In Durham, that way of life has existed for 100 years. Previously, this has been considered a moderate area, never taking industrial action without a ballot. Now, the miners are gripped by an epidemic of fear. The immediate focus of their concern is the colliery at Herrington, typical of many on Ian McGregor's closure list. It's old, it costs far more to mine the coal than the price it can be sold for. It costs £2 million a year in subsidies. Harsh economic logic dictates it should close. Logic ignores the fact that it gives work and sustenance to 700 men and their families.
Is the Herrington pit economically viable?
No.
Will it close?
I don't know. I have recommended it should close. It has gone before the board under the review procedure. I am awaiting the result of that meeting. But as it stands now, my recommendation is it should close.
What would happen to the men employed there?
Men will be redeployed. Any man who wants work will be given work in Durham.
If we don't stand up and fight this time on our own, we don't need to hide behind anyone else. This time, Durham wants to be in the front line, and we are in the front line.
In fact, the Durham coalfield has been in decline for 30 years.
Through the centuries, coal from the northeast was shipped from the Tyne, till by the time of Charles II, over 500,000 tonnes a year went south by sea. That's why no one ever dreamed of sending coals to Newcastle.
The oldest capitalist coalfield in Britain produced the energy to mill the steel which built the ships and boilers which powered the nation's trading empire. But within years of nationalisation, it was in decay. Pits were closing, the miners redeployed to collieries in the Midlands.
I'm going down, although I am a Durham lad brought up in Busty Cove. I'm going down, 'cause here the seams are all worked out and I don't want the dough. I'm going down to Nottingham, good prospects are my go. I'm going down, although it grieves me sore to leave the town and folk I know.
The closures and reorganisation were far more sweeping than anything planned by Ian McGregor. They involved wholesale disruption. Yet surprisingly, the unions went along with the plan.
I'm going down because I am a miner born. I'll stay a miner still.
The unions cooperated partly because their leadership was right-wing and partly because they still had some sense of confidence in the future of their industry. Since nationalisation, pits have closed all over Durham. In 1947, there were 134 mines. Today, there are only 11. Then, there were 108,000 miners. Today, there are only 17,000. Nationally, the mining workforce is a shadow of its former self, down from 700,000 miners in 1947 to 180,000 now.
We managed to do this not without difficulty, but it required a great deal of persuasion and understanding on both sides. But we did it because it was part of an agreed plan. It was coherent. It related to the future growth of the industry, and I believe that people understood what we were trying to do, that we were trying to build the industry up from strength to strength.
In the northeast, the management convinced the men that their future lay under the North Sea. There were massive reserves of coal to be exploited by a chain of collieries along the coastline. As the pits inland were closed, the coal board spent millions in developing new seams under the seabed. Even now, the management is investing £1 million a week in the successful pits of the northeast. At the more efficient collieries, although fewer miners are needed, the coal is cheaper to extract. The logic of closing down the holes in the ground where men toiled in mean, wet seams wasn't hard to sell to the union leaders in the past.
It's curious that so many pits should have closed down in the Durham area without the miners putting up a struggle. So why are they fighting now? Because what's interesting is that while this area used to be regarded as right-wing or moderate, it's now aggressively militant. To understand the reasons for that change is to understand a good deal of what the present dispute's about.
A handful of private open-cast mines in the Durham area are still working despite the strike, guarded by the police, picketed come rain or shine by dozens of miners. Ironically, most of the pickets are young men, the very people guaranteed a job in the new slimmed-down coal industry. There seems at first no reason for them to be protesting, no sense in their choosing to lose money when, the management say, there's no question of their losing their jobs. What's happened is that confidence and trust have collapsed. Arthur Scargill, not the local management, is the voice now listened to by formerly moderate miners like Kevin Inman.
Arthur Scargill doesn't tell people when to go on strike. He was elected by the members to do a job, and all he's doing now is doing that job. We've got to start the fight somewhere. This area is a quiet area, it's a moderate area, but we realise now this is the end of the line. And I'm only 29. If the colliery closes down, there's no prospect of getting a job in this area. So of course I'm going to bring up a young family. There's no means of support.
The younger miners like Kevin Inman were promised a secure future in the industry. So confident were they that they set about raising families and buying their homes. The new militants are mortgage men. They need their 120 or so pounds a week to meet their commitments. But so distrustful are they of management that they're prepared to rub along on £18.50 social security for a family of 4.
By being on strike, you're losing at least £100 a week.
Yes. But if I haven't got a job and I'm going to be on the dole, how much money am I going to lose then? If I'm going to be out on strike for 6 months, surely it's worth it in the end, because I might be on the dole till I retire if I'm 60.
Can you give an assurance that there will be no compulsory redundancies?
Yes, I can do that. I have already given that.
The coal board say that there's no question of you losing your job.
This year? Do they say that next year? Or do they say that the year after? Next year, if my colliery closes down, I might be moved into the colliery, but they don't guarantee me my job. I will be downgraded. I'm a trained electrician. If I get a job in another colliery, there's very little chance I'll be taken on as an electrician. So I'm going to lose the wages. I'm going to lose my trade where I did an apprenticeship for. That is if I'm lucky and get another job in another colliery.
We cannot guarantee that every fitter and every electrician would be employed in his trade immediately.
But you would hope to be able to do that?
Oh yes, we would try to do that.
You would accept, would you, that there appears to have been some sort of communication breakdown?
I would accept that. I genuinely believe we have failed to communicate with our labour force. And that is a responsibility that I carry along with the management staff in this area. I think there's been a general feeling throughout the whole of the country that there is going to be a butchering of the mining industry. It's become very emotive. And yet when you look at our own part of the world, we are in a stronger position now than ever we have been.
The problem in the northeast and across the nation is that a small number of pits are hopelessly expensive. Each ton of coal dug at Sacriston Colliery, for example, loses the coal board over £20. To be economically secure, to balance the books, these Victorian relics must be shut down. Ian McGregor plans to make the coal industry viable by closing 20 pits, losing 20,000 jobs, and cutting production by 4 million tonnes. All of this to be accomplished this year. But the miners fear that far from being the end, these closures may be the prelude to even more.
The McGregor plan calls for a loss overall of something like 20,000 jobs this year. Do you believe that that 20,000 will be an end to the matter?
No. I think if the industry is to improve its efficiency, then there will be less men employed in mining, particularly in this part of the world. We have got to improve our efficiency with the collieries that we have got left.
The McGregor plan at the moment talks about a need to close 20 pits and lose 20,000 jobs. Is that going to be enough?
Well, that will reduce the supply of coal by 4 million tonnes a year or thereabouts. And the way things are looking, we probably need to reduce it by 10 million tonnes of coal a year. So I'm afraid this is an ongoing rolling programme and that more pits will have to close.
Do you have any indication of how many jobs that might mean?
Well, I suppose at the end of the day it would probably mean about twice as many as we've been talking about. Not just the 20,000. We lost 20,000 jobs last year, perhaps 20,000 over the next couple of years, and then probably another 20,000 ahead of that.
It's unfair to say that the coal board hasn't invested in the future. At big new coalfields like Selby, huge amounts of money are being spent. It'll be the greatest colliery in Europe. But Selby will produce as much coal as the whole of Durham coalfield, with a quarter of the workforce. At Selby, the coal board has seen the future and seen that it works. To the accountants, Herrington Colliery has more use as an industrial archaeology site than anything else. The place is blighted by its history. 700 men and their families depend upon the pit. If it were in Belgium or France or Germany, government subsidies might make it viable. In Britain, if the government have their way, it'll close. The Herrington miners have their own views on what makes sensible economics.
Is it economical to give them on £60 a week on the dole, or to give them £60 to go down the pit and produce something? Which is the best economical? That's my question. If they give every miner a subsidy of £60 that works down Herrington pit, we'd be making a profit.
Who is it economical to? It's not economical to us to put us on the dole. It's not economical to the country to keep us once we're on the dole. Who is this economy? Who is it for? Why talk about economics and on one hand, and then have to keep them on the dole, which is costing, like you said, the taxpayers have to keep us on the dole. What are these economics for?
Let's have the coal in Britain mined properly and sensibly, and not just closing pits down because of what the government sees a short-term economic policy. Let's have a long-term policy like the plan for coal in the 70s. Let's get all the coal within this country out. Because it's not just our coal and our jobs, it's your coal and it's the country's coal.
His plan is to create 100 pits 100,000 miners, and then it'll be sold off to private investors. And we're not going to have it. It's a nationalised industry. It belongs to us, and we're going to keep it.
What's happening here is a painful change. The government has told the coal board it can't survive without changing. The miners are fighting not merely to maintain their jobs, but to preserve an entire way of life. In the profoundest sense, then, this isn't pure industrial action, but political struggle.
We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Amen. The fear which has seized many of the old mining communities is a bleak vision of the future, a sense of dereliction.
And as we celebrate the Lord's Passion on this Good Friday, in our minds is the miners' strike. And our feelings are so mixed. It's a strike expressing the fear of many about the future of their jobs and their children's jobs and their communities. A fear we can all recognise and identify with. There's been violence on the picket lines. I heard last night that Billy Stobbs, our lodge chairman, had to be taken to Sheffield Hospital with broken ribs.
Billy Stobbs, the local miners' leader, typifies the new mood of increasingly political militancy.
And we've got to change the Tory government's minds. And the rank and file member now knows he's not in a fight with the coal board. He's in a fight with the Tory government, and we know this. That's why 80% of our members now are on strike, official strike.
So as far as you're concerned, the fight is with the government?
Yeah, and no bones about it. And the rank and file member knows it's with the government to change the policies.
We have been told that this industry is to be run with less and less of a subsidy, and this is what we are now trying to put into practice.
Doesn't that mean that your current management strategy is politically dictated?
Yes, it could be, to a certain extent. I would accept that.
In the mining villages where the pit has often claimed the lives of dozens of its menfolk, the strike seems the only possible response to the government. In areas like Easington, the pit has an almost spiritual significance as protector and provider. Even before the McGregor plan, they had launched a campaign to save the local mines. If 20,000 jobs must go, that's not just 20,000 men, but 20,000 children who can't go down the pit to earn a living. Without jobs for school leavers, the community will wither. Without the miners' income, other businesses will falter.
The effect could be likened to a tree dying from the inside. You would have a decaying shopping centre. You would have decaying services. You would have decaying welfare facilities, because the district council will no longer have the rateable value to provide such services. The National Coal Board within the Easington district pay approximately £1.2 million a year in rateable value. These are the problems we're faced with. We are not just fighting for ourselves, for the miner and his job. We're fighting for the miner, we're fighting for his neighbour, we're fighting for the communities, we're fighting for youth, we're fighting for services, and we're fighting for the aged.
At Sunderland Airport, the government believe they may have part of the solution. Here, the Japanese Nissan car factory will be built. But initially, it'll only provide 500 jobs. 700 will go if Herrington mine closes. Many of the factories established to create employment in the 60s and 70s are empty or vandalized, memorials to a time when it seemed possible to do something else if the pit shut down. Now, people who thought coal would always provide see no prospect of ever getting a job. There are pockets where unemployment, particularly among the young, is almost unbelievably high.
We're talking in places in excess of 60%. For instance, the Department of Employment will indicate an unemployment rate of 20% in the Easington district. But that disguises the fact that in villages where collieries have already closed, there are unemployment rates in excess of 40%. And that in itself disguises the fact that individuals between the ages of 18 and 23, we're talking in terms of 60% being unemployed, with no hope whatsoever of having or gaining employment in the future.
In the town of Consett, the steel factory which once dominated the skyline is now razed to the ground. 3,500 men lost their livelihoods. This, say the miners, was also the work of Ian McGregor. It has to be said, though, that the redundancy terms being offered now, £1,000 for every year worked, are generous. But some miners see the Consett steelmen as a warning.
Ask them, well, if they're getting out their redundancy when there's no jobs in Consett for them because the steelworks is gone. I think it was 3,500 jobs went there. The redundancy money hasn't done them much good, and it's not going to do the people who's going to leave school this year and next year much good, because they've got no chance at all of getting anything.
How old are you?
I'm 34.
What sort of redundancy payment would you get?
I would get £20,000.
Well, £20,000 is a lot of money, isn't it?
It's more money than I'll ever save. But I mean, what's the point? That's 5 years' work. If you're keeping the job with the coal board, I've got another 20 years to go. That's £180,000.
But couldn't you do something with £20,000 in your pocket?
Like what? Do what? What? Set a business up? I'm an electrician by trade. Look at the electricians around here. Small businesses, one-time businesses. They're just taking out a living.
Is there anyone here who'd be prepared to accept the idea of getting a cash payment like that?
No, certainly not. I left school at the age of 15 and I started a pit at Lambton Pit. By 65, they'd closed that pit down and they transferred me to Silksworth Quarry. I worked at Silksworth Quarry and they told me then that there was no future in the pits then. So I got out the pits and I went and worked in factories. They've closed the factories round us. There's no jobs in the factories now up here. I went to the brickworks. The brickworks closed down. The part of the brickworks closed down. The only job I could get is back in the mines. I can't get a job anywhere else. So I've come back into the mines. And now they're going to close the mines down round us. I mean, I'm only 40-year-old. Where am I going to get a job? Am I going to be under the dole till I'm 65 now? If I didn't make a stand now and fight for my job now, I mean, I might as well just say, right, oh, let the country keep us. I don't want nobody to keep me. I want a job. That's all I want.
For the Durham miners, the local power station is an omen. On the edge of a coalfield, it's driven by nuclear energy. There are 14 nuclear power stations in Britain. Any decision to build more will hammer the coal industry.
At the moment, about 15% of our electricity is generated with nuclear power stations, and about 80% is based on coal. Now, if you were the chairman of the CGB, you would find that unsatisfactory. Indeed, they do, and in their statement of case at Sizewell, they say so. We do not want to be so dependent on one fuel, coal.
The miners' strike is doing nothing to inspire confidence. But if the coal board is to meet the government's targets, pits must close. In some once proud mining villages, they believe they've no future. They deserve better.
Mr. Smith, as a former miner yourself, the son of a miner who went down, as we heard in the song, what do you say to those men who've been given the impression there that if they'll be okay if they only accept this year's closures and the loss of about 20,000 jobs, aren't there yet more jobs to go in the coal industry?
Well, Mr. Emery, our problem this year is to complete the programme that we've started at the beginning of last year of getting rid of the final 8 million tonnes imbalance between what our customers want and what we were producing. And Durham is taking part as part of that reduction. Now, if I may say so, that programme started off by saying that Harrington is on the McGregor list and that there is implied a new plan, that we're starting off on a new plan. That isn't so, you know. It simply isn't right. Indeed, the discussions on Harrington were started before Mr. McGregor became the chairman of the National Coal Board.
But it will close.
Harrington it presently is under consideration at national level and within the procedure.
But isn't it Mr. McGregor's plan, new or not, that after these 20,000 jobs...
But you've just said, and your question was, by implication, that they've got cause to be frightened that there is a new plan. That isn't so. In the last 4 years, since 1980, demand for energy in this country has dropped by 44 million tonnes. the proportion of coal that demand has dropped to 18 million tonnes in that time. We'd got to the point where we were, in fact, producing very much more than we could sell. We tried to ease the impact, first of all, by increasing our exports. We managed to jump our exports by more than 7 million tonnes, taking advantage of the problems in Poland. We managed to persuade customers, primarily CGB and the other major customers, to take nearly twice as much as their normal working stocks. And the remainder we've put on the ground ourselves. The result was record stocks, all-time record stocks, more than 55 million tonnes of coal at the beginning of this year. During the year just past, we took 4 million tonnes out of the excess of 8 million tonnes left. Not a man was made redundant other than voluntarily. In the coming year, if we take the 4 million tonnes of output out, we'll be in market balance. In other words, we will be producing what we can sell. Now, we do know that there are a large number of customers that we can persuade to turn to coal from oil and gas. And indeed, one of the great sad things, in the county you've just been seeing the film about, ICI, I've got a works there, they were going to turn over a contract, change their system last month. It would have meant 450,000 tonnes a year, and they've deferred that. Whether we'll ever get it changed.
That may be so, Mr. Smith. May I ask you to go back to the question, though? How many more jobs will go after the 20,000 this year? That's what they're worried about.
If we can, in fact, increase our markets, attack the market and make it grow, we've got to get our economics right, we've got to get the output into balance, and then attack the market. There's a market there to be got. We can make jobs grow. We see in the northeast, the place that you've just again seen the film, at least 10 to 11 million tonnes, and then we can grow. There are reserves under the North Sea.
But are you saying that no more jobs will have to go then after the 20,000?
No one can say that in industry. Would it be possible for anybody in any industry
to say that? No, but I'm asking you to say it. Mr. Harrington said, your own North East director, that more jobs would have to go. Your own deputy chairman has said that maybe you'll have to get down to 140,000.
What the area director was saying was that as you improve efficiency, again, in any industry, you produce the same amount of coal, trying to do it with less men. That is a part of the modernisation of works. You know, again, I'm bound to say to you, we've spent something like £7 billion since Plan for Coal. We've closed 14 million tonnes of capacity. We've created 16 million tonnes of new capacity, which is working already. We've got 26 million more tonnes of new capacity presently being built at the present time.
Right.
And we're going to invest this year £800 million. To say that the industry is being run down, that there is a new plan to do that, and to cause those people in the northeast the fright and the fear which that programme helped to create, I don't think is a just thing to do.
They're on strike because they're frightened of what they think you're doing.
Well, as David Archibald said, perhaps our communication has been bad. The plain fact is that this industry has got to get advancing. But we're completing a task we started a long time ago.
Mr. Archibald, you're the man on whom much is being set in terms of running the negotiations.
I'm Ned Smith, by the way. Mr. Archibald was in the...
I beg your pardon, Mr. Smith. Mr. Archibald was up in the northeast. The McGregor plan is reportedly to phase the present 20,000 closures, to spread it out over a longer period than the year stated. Now, is that true? Is that what you're offering?
Well, that is another thing, you see. You say the McGregor plan. What happened was we had a meeting within the consultative procedure the week before last, in which, unfortunately, Mr. Scargill and the other members of the NUM executive didn't attend. But at that meeting, the other unions who were present asked a number of questions about what we might be able to do. One of them was, could it be possible to discuss the phasing of closures within individual areas? And the answer to that was, by all means. If we can meet, if we can discuss it, we can discuss it.
But can this year's programme, to have 20,000 jobs lost, the production cut by 4 million tonnes, as you say, can that be phased? Can that be spread out longer than a year?
We've got to get our market into balance. The 4 million tonnes is to get the market into balance.
But the answer is
phasing of closures within individual areas is a matter of the areas. Mr. Archibald and the unions there, and the other area directors and the other unions.
But that means, yes, it can be phased over a longer period than a year.
Discussions can take place in the areas as to what they're going to do.
But you're not answering the specific question.
Well, because we don't answer that at national level. We never have, Mr. Emery.
You're reported today as being ready to make a compromise in shifting the plan for closures of pits back to the areas. Is that accurate?
They've never been. The plan for the closure of collieries have always been discussed and decided at area level. Where there is disagreement finally, that comes to national headquarters for appeal, but that is a small number of the total that is agreed to for closure. Those discussions take place at area level. Indeed, I doubt that the members of the National Union Executive would agree that their area discussions should be brought up to national level for discussion.
But is there room for compromise there?
It would be for discussions in the area if they will join the discussion. What we need is the strike over and the discussions to start.
How are you going to get trust?
May I remind you?
Answer me this. How are you going to get trust back with those miners, with the who are responding to what Mr. Archibald out there caused the failure to communicate? How are you going to get that back?
Well, I sincerely hope, Mr. Emery, we can get trust back. Our industry has got a proud record of consultation, of understanding, of negotiating sensibly. I hope we can get it back. Sadly, the NUM at the present time, as you know, is itself divided. That is a pity, not only for the NUM, but for this industry and for management. I hope that we can get some common sense. Let me just say to you, we put proposals on the table on the 6th of March. We were asked to put our proposals forward. After that meeting, the National Union of Mine Workers made certain statements, and as a result, we've got industrial action. They haven't been back. The discussions are still there available. If we could get the meetings going, it's a matter for the National Union of Mine Workers to come and talk about it.
Mr. Smith, thank you very much indeed. Well, in a moment, I'll be talking to Mr. Scargill, but first, the government's role. Although Mrs. Thatcher refuses to intervene, the government's commitment is considerable. Meeting again today was the Cabinet's Special Coal Committee, with Mrs. Thatcher in the chair. Clearly, the government is underwriting the bill for Mr. Ian McGregor's tactics. The strike and the overtime ban before it have already cost the taxpayer well over an extra £200 million, and to that must be added the costs of extra policing. What the government is all out to avoid is a repeat of the early 70s, when miners' strikes became battles to overthrow a Conservative government. Once before, in 1981, Mrs. Thatcher backed down from a head-on clash, but this time she's backing Mr. Ian McGregor's showdown. That political and financial support are the measure of Mrs. Thatcher's determination to prove who this time carries the clout. The clearest proof was police reinforcement sent to Nottinghamshire to ensure that men who wanted to work would get safe passage through the picket lines. There have been clashes, but it's a far cry from 1972 and the confrontations at Saltley. During that miners' strike, Saltley outside Birmingham was the last big coal depot supplying gasworks and power stations. 800 policemen were no match for up to 15,000 pickets. Saltley was a major lesson for both sides. For Arthur Scargill, it was triumph for his flying pickets. 2 years later, the miners brought down the Heath government, and ever since, politicians and Whitehall planners have been haunted by the failure to keep Saltley open. After 2 governments in a row were defeated by Union power, Mrs. Thatcher's approach to the miners was to avoid confrontation where she could, while preparing for any eventuality. The lessons of the 70s she had vowed to learn were to escape the trap of a formal pay policy, also to change the law on picketing. A third lesson was that troops could be used in industrial disputes, but that they couldn't do everything. Mrs. Thatcher inherited from the last Labour government a makeshift method of using troops, as in the 1977 firemen's strike, without the drastic step of a state of emergency. This government is sure it can cope, using its sophisticated contingency planning arrangements. The Civil Contingencies Unit, the CCU, is located here in the Cabinet Office, just round the corner from number 10 Downing Street. The present Secretary to the Cabinet, Sir Robert Armstrong, has spelt out the unit's requirements. An organisation which could be brought into effective action at an hour's notice at any time of the day or night and stay in action. That was in his Times obituary to the brigadier who joined the civil service to set it all up. But it's here in Cobra, the Cabinet Office briefing room, that many of CCU's officials have been masterminding the government's response to the Libyan crisis. It's the same room where the CCU plans emergency measures, including dealing with an industrial crisis. It's a secret location somewhere behind this Whitehall facade. A senior minister in this government, Lord Whitelaw, chairs the meeting of ministers, officials and military men who can be in instant touch with a network of chief constables, major generals commanding military districts, and emergency committees set up by the government in the regions. The men who run the CCU don't talk to the press, but head of the secret unit under Labour was a senior diplomat who now gives the insider's view.
My view of it And I think the view of all the officials on it, certainly, and I believe the view of all the ministers on it, when I sat on it, was that it is in no sense is it intended as a strike-breaking machine.
Not to pull the government's chestnuts out of the fire?
Well, to pull the country's chestnuts out of the fire, let me put it like that. I mean, I'm not talking about making you or me comfortable in our home because we're inconvenienced by a strike. If my lights go out because the electricity goes off, well, then it's just too bad. If your lights go out, I don't care a bit. What I do care if the lights in the operating theatre goes out when somebody's having their appendix taken out. And that is the sort of thing which we are actually looking at.
How often did you consider the use of troops?
All the time. Because at any moment we might face a situation where we had to use troops. But you don't need legislation to use troops. The use of troops can be authorised by an order of the Defence Council, which means a signature by 2 members of the Defence Council, probably a Defence Minister and a Chief of Staff. And this is authorised by Parliament under the Emergency Powers Act of 1964, and they can be used for any urgent national purpose.
Running power stations is the one thing everyone agrees the military can't do, but they could move supplies. And the confidence the CCU gives the government in keeping essential services going has been boosted by the last big lesson this government learned from the 70s. Don't face a miners' strike with coal stocks run down.
Well, present coal stocks are really extremely high. They're about 1.5 times what they were at the start of the previous disputes in the early 1970s. And the critical area, of course, is the Central Electricity Generating Board, where stocks are also very high. They've got about 17 or 18 weeks of stocks already built up. So you're thinking, I think, in terms of a strike which would have to last until the autumn before there'd be any effect at all on electricity generation, even if the industry took no offsetting steps to save coal usage. And they could do plenty to save coal as well.
What options would the Central Electricity Generating Board have if they began to run down because of a very long strike?
Well, the electricity industry can elongate the stock position very easily by switching to oil-fired burners. They can do that for about 12% of the total energy usage. And also by using their nuclear stations in the summer instead of closing them for maintenance. Now, if they do that, they can elongate their stocks probably up to about 25 weeks. So we're talking about at least 6 months before the strike really starts to bite.
Now, of course, moving of coal to power stations, seeing what the stocks are at power stations is important, but not digging coal out of the pits.
Well, who would be doing that if there were a coal strike?
Well, not the soldiers.
Not the soldiers. They wouldn't dig it out of pits, but who would be moving the coal around? That was something that
well, I think that if there was I imagine, and we didn't actually look at this in the situation in 78, 79, because it didn't arise, but I think we would have envisaged then, and I think any plans we had in the back of our minds, and even on paper, then dealt with the question of possibly introducing troops to move coal from the pit head to power stations.
The dispute finds the government saying little publicly, but privately, ministers are confident they've never been in a stronger position to see off a coal strike.
Is this a particularly good time for the miners to have taken on the government?
Well, the summer is never a good time to start a coal action in the first place. It's particularly true this year when you've got almost record level of coal stocks. To say that the miners really shouldn't have picked this moment, I think that they will lose this strike if they start it now. They would be much better advised to try and run down the stocks in a long overtime ban until next winter and have an all-out strike then.
If the Nottinghamshire miners keep on producing coal, how does that affect coal stocks? What proportion?
Well, last week about a third of total production was still being produced by Nottinghamshire miners and others. And of course, if that continued, then the stocks would last another 1/3 times what I've already mentioned. And that would take you probably through to next spring. So we really do need, if Mr. Scargill and the NUM are going to win this, he does need to have a completely solid strike from all the members of the NUM.
Well, Mr. Scargill, haven't you in fact picked the wrong time? How, with a lot of your men still working and some of the other unions in doubt, how are you going to win this one?
Well, with respect, we haven't picked the time at all. It was the National Coal Board's announcement to close pits and to make our men redundant that created this dispute in the first place. And you know, the Coal Board are dishonest. In June last year, the chairman of the coal board said that the intention of the board was to take 25 million tonnes capacity out of this industry, bearing in mind that Selby was coming on stream. Now that's 6 times more than they've publicly admitted. And even their announcement on the 6th of March was not a 4 million tonne capacity reduction, as is constantly referred to in the media. It was 105.6 million tonnes a year ago in their budget, and this year's budget is 97.4 million tonnes, which by any arithmetic is an 8.2 million tonnes reduction.
They, of course, dispute those figures. And my question to you was, can you win given what's stacked against you? If you didn't choose it, you certainly come out on strike and called a strike. You've picked a time of summertime with the government apparently prepared. Your own members in other pits like Nottingham and other areas of northwest England still working. How can you win is the answer.
Well, I'll answer that in 1 second, but can I make this point? Because you see, it is very important as far as we're concerned. We're constantly asking the coal board to debate with us, and they will not, and there's a reason. I've got the coal board documents here for the 2 years in question. And if you look at those 2 documents, it's an 8.2 million tonnes reduction. They're not my figures, they're the coal board's figures. Now, turning to your question. The National Union of Mine Workers do not want to go on strike, but we're faced with an impossible situation. The board are going to close over 20 of our pits, and they are going to run down this year the manpower level by over 20,000. Faced with that position, we either stand up and fight and defend our industry and our jobs, or we don't. And that's why the Miners' Union have taken the decision to fight.
Yes, I know why you've taken the decision, but I'm asking how you're going to win, especially, say, when you've got all these workers in Nottinghamshire still going. Now, you're concentrating on Nottinghamshire yourself. You've been there 3 times. You're going to hold a big rally there this week. What happens if they still won't obey what you're ordering them to do, if they still carry on working? Doesn't that defeat your strike?
Well, all we can say is that we are confident, even if Nottingham continued to work, we could win this dispute. Obviously, it would be that much more easy if the Nottinghamshire miners would respond and support their own union. And the extent to which Nottingham is important is recognised by the National Coal Board. Tomorrow, for example, they're offering to give every miner in the Nottinghamshire coalfield who's still working a day off as a holiday day, as a rest day, to go and demonstrate at their own union headquarters in support of coal board policy. An astonishing position, but nevertheless true. And my advice to Nottinghamshire miners is the same advice that Roy Hattersley gave on Sunday. If I were a Nottinghamshire miner, as he said, if I were a Nottinghamshire miner, I would be on strike.
But without them, you've written this, without the rest of the country supporting you, you won't be able to win. I just put it to you that you're onto a loser this time.
Well, I don't accept that. I'm firmly convinced that with the support that we already have in the wider trade union movement, that we're on a winner. We've already reduced the coal stocks both within the CEGB and indeed within the coal board itself dramatically. And more important, of course, the steel industry and other industries are already feeling the pinch. Some of them have only got about 2 or 3 weeks supply left. And that's what I meant on Saturday when I said we've got to tighten the knot. As far as we're concerned, we're fighting not on a political platform, we're fighting for the right to work. And that's our aim. We want to defend pits because we produce the cheapest deep mine coal in the world. We've achieved on the coalface an average output increase of 5.4% per year for the last 10 years. And quite frankly, all that we're being rewarded with is the sack. It's vitally important to remember that we are subscribing to the plan for coal. We were signatories to that. We want to see the plan for coal implemented. The other 2 signatories to the agreement, the government and the coal board, want to go away from it.
You say that the coal board won't debate with you publicly. Why won't you talk to them when they offer you talks? Are you saying that there can be never any more closures of any pits when you say you won't talk to them about closures?
No, I'm sorry. We are saying that we will talk to them at any time. But we are also saying that we're not prepared to talk about the closure of pits or the rundown of manpower levels. We've never refused to discuss with the National Coal Board within the agreed conciliation scheme. Last October, the National Coal Board broke off negotiations with this union, and there's only one meeting taken place since, and that was on the 6th of March, when they announced their closure programme. We will meet the Coal Board tonight within the conciliation scheme to talk about the expansion of this industry in line with the plan for coal. In 1979, the Conservative government agreed to support the plan for coal introduced by the Labour government in 74, and more important, in 1981 further demonstrated their support for that plan for coal. Today they're abandoning that plan for coal, and in doing so threatening about 70 to 80,000 miners.
But the plan has always implied closing off pits, and your union accepted pit closures. Are you now implying, when you say that you're ready for conciliation, to talk about expanding? The coal board wants to talk about expanding eventually, once you've got over this hump. Will you actually talk to them about closing pits?
We will not talk to the National Coal Board or anyone else about closing pits. Pits do exhaust. And the plan for coal talks about exhaustion.
But what about when they exhaust? Will you close them?
Well, of course they close themselves. We've never adopted a Luddite attitude. Pits do close as a result of exhaustion. We're talking about pits with hundreds of years of coal reserves in them. We're talking about pits that are being closed on strict economic grounds. And it costs the British taxpayer twice as much to put miners out of work as it does to give a subsidy. In Western Europe, for example, and in communist countries, they give subsidies to the tune of £50 and £60 per tonne. If we had that kind of subsidy, or alternatively, if they stopped their subsidy, this country would have a mining industry producing for the British taxpayers £2,000 million profit.
Yes, you know that the government is not going to give you the kind of subsidies you want. They have been elected to run the country, and they are going to propose plans for subsidising new investment and so on. Listen, Mr. Heathfield, your General Secretary, has said, and he's been in touch with Mr. Smith, that if the Coal Board withdraw their list, that you might talk. Now, what are the minimum conditions you have, actually, for sitting down and getting on talks with them?
Well, Mr. Heathfield and Mr. Scargill have both sent a letter to the National Coal Board stating that we are prepared to talk to the National Coal Board at any time. And on the 6th of March, again, we reiterated to the Coal Board that we wanted to talk about no pit closures, no rundown in manpower levels.
But
we wanted to talk about
let me hold you there. When you say
policy.
no pit closures, you've already conceded that if there are exhausted pits, you would talk about them. So why do you come out so categorically?
With respect, Mr. Emery, let's not talk silly about this. No one's ever argued that a pit that exhausts can be kept open. And so we're talking about economic closures, those determined by the Conservative government and the Coal Board's policy.
So you'll determine them? You'll determine what's economic?
No, what we're saying is that if there's a pit that is exhausted, there's no argument. But we're not prepared to accept that a pit should be closed on economic grounds when in economic terms it costs the taxpayers of Britain twice as much as it would to keep that pit open.
If you stay out for 6 months, pits will close and never reopen.
Why?
Are you prepared to see that happen?
Why?
Well, for technical and geological reasons.
I don't accept
That's what
that,
the
I'm
Coal
sorry.
Board says.
Well, the Coal Board are again misleading the British public. Pits do not require to close because of the fact that we're on strike. British management at the present time are maintaining them, and there is no reason why the National Union of Mine Workers should not go along and save any pit that happens to be threatened. And they know, and we know, that we would do that if a pit was threatened, say, for example, with fire. But make no mistake about it, as far as the NUM is concerned, we're fighting for the survival of our industry and for the right to work. It's important, in my view, that young people today also have their future safeguarded. And quite frankly, if the British taxpayers understand that Mr. McGregor's stewardship has already cost them over £1,000 million as a result of this strike, it's already cost the British taxpayers over £100 million in policing, and even more incredibly, cost over £100 million to use oil rather than cheap British coal.
You know that the figures are disputed. I don't want to get into a dispute over the figures on that. Let me put this question to you. If your case is so strong, why haven't you supported the call of your men who are still carrying on working, going through the picket lines? Why haven't you supported their call for the traditional national ballot?
Mr. Emery, what we have done is to support the 80% of our members who have already determined what the policy of our union will be.
I know you've done that.
And in accordance with the democratic process in my union, we have adopted the policy that they say we should.
But it doesn't answer the question, does it?
Well, with respect, it does. I don't want the BBC to tell me how to run the affairs of the NUM. And secondly, I don't want anybody who's not been elected to a position like you, for example, to tell us what we should do within our own
I'm not telling you, I'm
organisation.
asking you why you won't do what they're asking you.
Well, with respect, what I'm telling you is that a majority of our people, 80% of them, are on strike. And in accordance with the constitution of our union, they are telling us what we should do. And as democratically elected officials, we're carrying out that policy. My appeal to the Nottinghamshire miners and anyone else who's still working is to join this dispute. And the quicker they do, the quicker we shall win it.
Mr. Scargill, thank you very much. Well, that's all from Panorama tonight. We shall be back in a fortnight. Good night.